How's it going, everybody? Just hanging out in my car here after a day of gold mining, and something that's been on my mind is how wide should a sluice box be? This is something I kind of just want to film something stream of consciousness here. I know in the comments we get a lot of good feedback, so rather than trying to get this all dialed in and edit, I'm just going to assume that I don't have all the answers, but I want to share my thoughts on sort of what I've seen. I was recently watching Tyler on the mining channel. Now, the mining channel is a fresh channel, not super popular yet, but I can tell it's going places. You should go check it out if you like fabricating and stuff like that. Also, Andy Thrax. He's got a channel where he's doing the same idea. He's running a wash plant and he's got a big sluice box. And if you look at what these guys are running, their sluice boxes, relatively speaking, are really, really narrow compared to what I'm using here in Alberta. So on the mining channel, he has a 3-foot wide sluice box. And I'm not sure what the throughput is of his trommel, but you know, I'd assume somewhere between 10 and 30 yards per hour. So the yards per hour per foot of sluice width is huge. And if you look at the Clarkson sluice study or the Poling sluice study or all of these studies, and you just sort of see what these big commercial outfits are running, they're running a lot through a 1-foot wide sluice. You might see 160 US gallons per minute per foot of sluice width. Maybe as low as 100, maybe as high as 300. Like, they're just hammering water through these boxes, and they're actually getting pretty good capture rates. Now, I can tell you straight up, the guy on the mining channel, he knows what he's doing, and he's not willing to lose a ton of gold. So how is it that he's got a 3-foot wide sluice for this big machine operation, and I'm sitting here thinking maybe my 2-foot wide sluice isn't enough to keep up with one guy shoveling? So the other side of the story here is, let's take another company that knows what they're doing, been doing this for a while. We'll look at Keen Engineering's Gnome Beach Box. This is a 24-inch wide box. It's got a very low energy matting in it, and it's what they use on the beach in Nome. Not only that, but all of the locals are using boxes just like that. Anytime you see somebody on the beach in Nome, it's this 24-inch wide, big plywood box, low energy matting in it, and it's one person shoveling slowly the beach sand into this box. So how is it that one person needs a 24-inch wide sluice box to keep up with them, and yet a 36-inch wide sluice box can keep up with an entire mining operation running well over 10 yards per hour? Well, it's the type of gold you're after. So in my experience, if you have a very low energy box, so I do have a 24-inch wide, my own version of the beach box, I'm running rough top conveyor belt in there, and you run a very thin sliver of water over the surface. It is just enough to take the sand you put on the surface, wash the sand off, and you can see the black sand in that sluice box forming these little like gravel bars. And the gravel bars will disappear about halfway down the box, so they're actually active, and you have to wait until you put the next shovel in. Excuse me. You have to wait until you put the next shovel in to actually make sure that black sand gravel bar doesn't grow too long and the little tails go too far down the box and the gold just sort of flutters out with all that black sand. So because you have such a low slope and a low flow rate, it can't process very much material at all, right? Now, if you have a box that's narrower, so for example, if I'm running the same sort of high energy sluice box, whether that be the 1-inch angle iron riffles, 15 degrees angled up, or a really aggressive diamond grading on top, like a aggressive raised expanded on top of miner's moss, for example, you need maybe a 3-inch sluice to keep up with me. I actually did build the 1-inch angle iron sluice. I believe I made it 4 inches wide, and I ran it with my Honda WX15 pump pretty much flat out. So let's say 50 or 60 gallons per minute. And that's actually under feeding the water compared to what some of these studies are saying you need for these aggressive riffles. It actually caught about 70% of the gold in the primary box. This, not Fraser River gold, but sort of, BC gold like that. I was pretty impressed. This was a 24-inch long sluice just as a test, 4 inches wide, just running water like crazy through it. And it did fairly well. But Anytime you see people going after this beach gold, this ultra fine, flat, flaky gold, they have this really wide box running really low energy instead. And I'm going to try to use a couple analogies to explain why I think that is important. I do not think the guys running their big commercial operations with a narrow hot sluice box are wrong. I think that they know what they're doing. I think that they're seeing what their losses are, and I think they're running the appropriate sluice box for their situation. I also think that the guys running these 24-inch wide beach boxes know what they're doing, and they're running the appropriate box for their situation. So why is it different? Well, everyone always says that the larger gold is easier to capture than smaller gold. And that was an assumption that I just went along with. And until recently, I thought that was across the board true. Hear me out, because I know what you're thinking. So the way this works is if you take a 1 centimeter cube of gold, that is 19.3 grams if it was pure gold, and it has a surface area of 6 square centimeters, right? Like one on the top, one on the bottom, one on the left, one on the right, one on the front, one on the back. Now, if you just cut this in half right down the middle and you open it up, you still have the same surface area on the outside, but you now have 2 square centimeters extra. So you've got 8 square centimeters of surface area, same 19.3 grams. Then if you cut it, across all 3 planes, so essentially instead of 1 cube, you now have 8 smaller half centimeter cubes. The same weight of gold, 19.3 grams, now has double the surface area. And this sort of continues exponentially as you keep shrinking it down. So the smaller the particle, the smaller the cube of gold, the more surface area relative to its weight that you're going to have. And so if you have an elutriation column, I believe is what it's called, but basically a column of water going vertically, those fluid bed sluices kind of work on this principle, which is why you will never see a fluid bed sluice being used in Alberta for this flour gold. It doesn't work very well here. Let me get back to the fine gold is not always harder to catch part. So if they're cubes of gold, the smaller the cube of gold, the less fast it's going to fall down the water. So a big cube of gold is going to drop down that water really quick. So you speed up the speed of this water column, and all of the different particles of gold sort of separate out by their size. Small gold will shoot out the top, heavy gold will fall. So what you do is you screen them all to the same size, and then your black sand, being lighter for the same size cube, goes out the top of the elutriation tube, and there you go. Getting a little off topic here, but basically if the gold is all the same shape, the smaller gold will fall slower in the water and therefore be harder to capture in a sluice. But in Alberta, what I've noticed, especially when you look at this through a microscope, the gold is very flat. It's kind of like a piece of paper. The Fraser River flakes actually have a little bit more of like a cornflake type dimension to them, where they're a little bit thicker in the middle sometimes. Pretty flat, but still a little bit thicker. Alberta gold, some of the largest flakes I've ever seen, literally look like a piece of paper, maybe with a little corner folded up. They're like flat. And if you tear a piece of that paper off, that corner off, you have a smaller piece. So the big flake and the really small speck are both the same thickness. So if you think about just the surface area of these two pieces of gold, the tiny little piece, while it's a smaller piece of gold, it's more like a cube. And it's actually going to drop out of the water flow more easily. Whereas the bigger flake, because it's just paper thin, is sort of going to flutter down the sluice box. Another little analogy is working on the prairies in Calgary, Alberta, framing houses. If you have a 4x8 sheet of plywood, 3/8 of an inch thick, good wind comes in, it'll pick one of these sheets up right off the top of the pile and fling it across the job site. So you always got to put some weight on those piles on the windy days. Whereas a little 1 foot chunk, like a cut off of that same sheeting, will never get picked up and flown away. So that is why I actually think that mining this Alberta gold, a piece that's sort of plus 30 mesh, you hardly ever find anything plus 20 mesh, but sub 20 plus 30 mesh, that stuff's actually harder to keep than the minus 50 mesh, simply because of the shape of the gold. It's more like a wing. And because it's so difficult to capture that flat gold, first of all, why is it flat? I think it's because of the purity. I've measured the purity of Alberta gold somewhere between 89 and 91% purity, depending on where you get it. So if gold is really, really pure, it can get hammered into that paper thin stuff. Whereas if the gold's maybe mid 80s to low 80s, it might tend to sort of crack apart and remain slightly more round. It'll still get flat, but compared to the purer the gold, the flatter it can get. And that might be why, excuse me, just had dinner. That might be why we actually see such flat gold out in the prairies, is because of its high purity. You'll see stuff like this, like on the cottonwood as well. It's this really flat type of gold. Where was I here? So the flat, paper type gold, it really needs a low energy water system to have a chance to even settle out in the first place, if that's the type of gold you're going to have. So it's not necessarily that all 100 mesh gold is equally difficult to capture, because there's really, really fine gold on the Fraser River. There's really, really fine gold in Alberta, but it's the shape and the flatness of those flakes that make them really difficult to capture. So I saw a pay streak form once. I was out gold mining. I was somewhere. I was out in Alberta, and a big flood came in, right? So I had just dug out the top 3-4 inches of ground, which is where I typically find the highest concentration of gold. Bunch of trees are flowing down the river because, the big flood comes in, and just these are getting torn out of the banks on the side creeks. I'm kind of concerned about my boat where it's tied up, but the water comes up. I'm watching the app to make sure, high water is going to peak and come back down and I'll be safe and everything. So I stayed the night. And that evening, I'm sitting there at the side of the river, and probably about 8 feet into the river, I can see the water flowing by. And it's flowing by, it's not like churning, it's not gurgling, making a ton of sound. You can see the little, bubbles and stuff from the flood and twigs sort of floating by. And it's just this calm, slow thing. It was maybe a foot to 18 inches deep of water, 8 feet out. The next morning, the water had receded, and right where I was looking in that area, nothing crazy. It wasn't like an eddy coming back upstream or anything. It was just water flowing down the river, top end of the gravel bar. There was a fresh layer, a fresh pay streak that had formed. I had dug it all out the prior day, and it had formed a fresh layer. There was not enough energy there to move even a pebble this big. There was no gravel that had moved. There was just a layer of sand that had gotten picked up from the cut bank upstream, and that sand was just dragged over the very, very surface. So all the little rocks that were there acted as a sluice box, and this sand just slowly, low energy, got dragged over the surface along with some black sand, along with some gold, and there was a fresh deposit about an inch thick of really good gold in that area. That's how that gold naturally got placed on the gravel bar by the side of the river, right at the very surface. So those are the conditions that I would want to replicate in my sluice box. So because of that, I want that slow water flow, low slope, really low energy system. And if I'm going to have those settings, I can't feed it very quickly. It can't handle a lot of material. And so in order to keep up with one person shoveling, you need that really wide sluice box. That's kind of where the Alberta Gold is different. The other sort of thing I wanted to mention is the type of mat. I have mentioned that the Dream Mat Mini Mat is too aggressive for Alberta before. And I don't mean that it's a bad mat, because I think it's just the wrong mat for this gold. In order for those little spirals to be active, they need a certain amount of energy. If you run that mat at this ridiculously low and slow speed, there is not enough energy to get those, vertical spirals spinning, and you wind up actually having regular horizontal spirals spinning behind some of the little pieces, but it's not designed for that. So its recovery is just not good at all if you ran that slow. And then when you run fast enough for it to start working, you do run into the potential for some of these little flat flakes to scour out because it's just a little bit too hot for that type of gold. The same thing could be said about any of the more aggressive mats. They all have a range, right? Like any mat, if you run it too hot, it'll just blow out gold. Like, take a fire hose, it'll clean gold out of almost anything. So there's a range where at the low end, the mat starts to actually be active and work, and at the high end, the mat starts to scour out and no longer work. So you want to stay within that range. And certain mats just cannot operate in a low enough range to still be active and still be functioning, which is why things like indoor-outdoor carpet, a wool blanket, the golden fleece, these things work really, really well in this super fine flat gold, because the energy required to make that mat actually work and exchange out is really, really, really low. You just have to feed it really, really, really slowly. And so if I was going to design the ultimate Alberta highbanker, my starting point would be that I'm going to need a very wide sluice box, so that while running a very low water flow and low slope, I can actually keep up with my shoveling rate of one person. That's why I can't get away with running a 4-inch wide sluice, which could easily handle the yards per hour I could shovel if I was running at the same settings as some of these other operations. One final thing that would be sort of just interesting as an example of people who are using this really slow, wide sluice box. There's a company that makes these like $5 million dredges somewhere. I don't know if it's Alaska or the Yukon or something, but it's like a 15-inch cutter head suction dredge. Sort of like Tony Beat's big bucket line dredge, but it's a cutter head 15-inch suction dredge. Things like a giant factory. And around the entire deck of the thing, which is probably, I don't know, like 60 feet long, 40 feet wide. I'm making up numbers because I just remember seeing this. There is a series of 2-foot wide sluices that look like they're 4 or 5 feet long around the entire thing. And so I'm assuming there's a primary sluice box and then a screen and a sump system that feeds all that really fine screened material around the entire deck of this thing. You probably have over 100 feet width of sluice box compared to, you've all seen Tony Beat's dredge. It's a much narrower sluice box, still capturing good gold in his area. But if you're going for this absolute powder, super fine flat gold, you really need to go wide, low, and slow to capture it. Yeah, so anyways, that's all the information I have in this video. I didn't really want to like edit and take pictures and put all that in. I might try to do another version of this when I've sort of refined my thoughts a little bit better in the future. And based on some of your feedback, I can obviously then take some of these theories of mine and actually test them out a little bit on this Alberta Gold and sort of see how different mats work at different flow rates and all that kind of stuff. But this is just sort of my thought process, trying to think through analogy. What is working for other people for this type of gold? Is Alberta Gold actually that fine? I think it is. I think it's particularly flat for how fine it is due to its high purity. And yeah, I think the approach for my highbanker is going to be that I need probably between 18 to 24 inches of sluice width to keep up with my shoveling. And whether I do that in a single 18 to 24 inch wide sluice, or if I make like a 10-inch wide sluice with a double level to help double that flow and keep things a little more compact, we'll see sort of what I wind up with when I get there. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening. I know that the light has pretty much faded here, so I might just be a dark blur talking to you. Appreciate anyone who is watching. I hope this sort of got your creative juices flowing a little bit, and we'll catch you in the next video. Cheers, everyone.